So, okay, let's go on and jump into our second article, which is an article that offers solutions uh, to marketers who don't have strong relationships, whose brands don't have strong customer relationships. And what Scott and Mansour and their colleagues do is they look at this idea of psychological distance. And using that as the premise, they then offer strategies for managing really the status quo in brand relationships. And these strategies really do seem to work. So we're joined by Scott Connors of Western University in Canada and Mansour Kamatov of Indiana University. Welcome, Scott and Mansour. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you for tuning in to our presentation today. Thanks again for inviting us to participate in the webinar, to you, Chris, and the entire JM team. The two of us are incredibly excited to share with you our newest journal marketing research on leveraging consumer brand relationships on behalf of our co-author team. While prevailing marketing practice is to encourage ever stronger relationships between consumers and brands, such relationships are rare, and many consumers are relationship averse or content with the status quo. This focus is also reflected in prevailing brand management approaches that, for instance, seek to move consumers from weak or indifferent relationship on one hand to stronger ones, where the consumer is more attached, more connected to, or in love with the brand. To underscore this point, we asked 323 consumers to list all the brands that were important to them. And on average, we found that respondents listed only 2.15 brands, and fewer than 1% of respondents listed 10 or more brands. This is coupled with some prior work reporting that as many as 77% consumers indicate that they actually do not forge strong relationships with brands. And similarly, if we look at the industry research, for example, Havas' work, they suggest that a majority of brand content is not meaningful, and consumers would simply not care if 77% of brands completely disappeared.
Right. So as indicated by the sheer volume and variation of consumer brand relationship types, as you can see in the background of the slide here, consumers often do not experience or seek these strong brand relationships. Strong relationships, as Mansour alluded to, are in fact rare in a brand context. The implication is that marketers are fixated on building the types of relationships that countless consumers simply may not want. In essence, choosing what is potentially a wasteful relationship upgrading strategy as a result of potentially disregarding consumer preferences. So in response, we highlight the value of embracing the relationship status quo. This raises our primary research question. How can we better manage the various types of relationships that consumers have with a brand? That is, our focus is on creating value from these existing brand relationships. To address this question, we draw on the concept of psychological distance. We focus here because while consumers may engage in many types of brand relationships, most implicate the consumer's self-concept. What we know here is that consumers incorporate the brand into their self-concept to varying degrees. This has commonly been assessed as, the extent to which the brand overlaps with or is included in the self, or the extent to which the brand is me and I am the brand. In our research, we assert that at their base level, these self-brand associations all tap a fundamental psychological concept known as psychological distance. So at its core, psychological distance reflects a subjective feeling in an abstract sort of psychological space, how far a target is perceived to be from the self. And importantly, it can be impacted by one's social interactions. For example, you might perceive your good friend to be psychologically close, whereas the nice waiter who served you back in the pre-COVID times might be more psychologically distant. So as consumers at least metaphorically view brand relationships akin to the way they do interpersonal relationships, we show that this similarly impacts the psychological distance of a brand. So to give you another example, let's think of that proud BMW owner colleague that we all have that lives and breathes the brand. In this case, you can see how the brand would be psychologically close for this individual. On the other hand, consider a male colleague of mine who enjoys a good vodka soda made with Skinny Girl's sparkling water, however, is very quick to hide the empty bottles whenever I'm over for a drink. In this example, you could see how the brand might be more perceived as more psychologically distant, despite the fact that in either case here, you can see that these brands are ones that consumers purchase and consume frequently. What's particularly interesting about psychological distance is it affects how abstractly people think about these concepts. Based on the notion of construal level, we show that people tend to think about close brands more concretely. This low level of construal makes sense. The closer the brand is, the more you're talking about it, rehearsing it, using it, so you have more concrete, detailed information stored in memory. However, for distant brands, consumers tend to think about them more abstractly. This high level of construal captures just the overall gist of the information necessary to capture the essence of what the brand is. Given that consumers think about close versus distant brands at varying levels of construal, we showed that value can be created from these existing brand relationships by focusing on whether consumers feel close or distant to a brand and matching this with the construal level of marketing communications. Matching creates what's called a congruency effect that makes the information easier to process, which in turn leads to more favorable responses to the brand. That is, when your market segment consists of people that feel distant to the brand, it's more effective to use high-level, abstract language. And when consumers feel close to your brand, it's more effective to use low-level, concrete language in brand communications. I'll kick it back over to Mansoor now, who will show you exactly how we do this.
So let's take a look at one of our studies as an example. We conducted this field study to test our predictions examining direct purchase behavior. 158 volunteers were recruited through a large public university in Singapore to take part in a study about this high-end Singaporean tea brand called TWG. In the central location of the university campus, we set up a trade table for TWG, which is a brand that many local participants feel quite close to, whereas a good number of locals, they feel fairly distant from. We altered construal level of marketing communications by showing them one of the two versions of an advertisement that you can see on your screen. In the concrete condition, the advertisement used more concrete language. So for example, allow the tea bag to steep for 4 minutes, no more, no less. During this time, the tea leaves open, hydrate, and infuse the cup with the essence and aroma of tea fruit and flowers. And in the abstract condition, the advertisement instead used more abstract language, such as, while the tea steeps, the ethereal essence envelops and soothes because of each tea's playful yet calming aromas. And after viewing the advertisement, participants were finally given an opportunity to purchase a sample pack of 3 of the featured teas using a pay what you will structure. What we found was that for consumers who perceived TWG distant, the amount paid was at least 35% higher when the ad featured abstract as compared to concrete language. Whereas when TWG was viewed as a close brand, the amount paid was at least 28% higher when the ad featured concrete compared to abstract language. What this really means is that consumer spending was indeed higher when distance between the consumer and brand matched with construal level of marketing communications. And these findings directly support our framework and are consistent with findings of our other studies, one of which Scott is going to present you next.
So yeah, let's take a look at a second study. In this one, we paid 156 Canadian student and community volunteers for something that they'd taken part in earlier in a research session. So we knew they'd have some cash on hand. Having assessed their level of self-brand distance using, sorry about that. How do we back this up? Having assessed their level of brand distance using the zipper scale, which you see on the left, which asks consumers to select the pair of circles that best captures the overlap between their self and the brand, we informed them that Molson Canadian, which is a beer brand in Canada, had partnered with the OSPCA and was raising money to support its animal shelters and had asked if we would share their advertisement with our participants. The ads varied between conditions based on a how versus why manipulation, that is a well-established manipulation of construal level from psychology. So this is based on the idea that thinking repeatedly why you use an object makes you think more abstractly about it, while thinking how you use an object repeatedly makes you think more concretely. So in the why condition, we said why your donation is important, such as because it ensures healthy animals. And in the how condition, we listed reasons how the donation makes a difference, such as by providing medical care. So while the construal level of the information was different, the content between each point remained the same. We then gave them the opportunity to donate some of their earnings to the cause, and the amount donated was our focal outcome here. So what we see with the results is similar to what Mansoor showed in that other study. If the brand is distant, spending was at least 67% higher when we use abstract compared to concrete language. And when the brand was perceived to be close, spending was at least 88% higher, or I guess donations were 88% higher when we used low-level concrete language over high-level abstract language. And so donations were higher when the distance between the consumer and the endorser brand matched with the construal level of marketing communications. So what does all this mean for management? It's well understood that a high level of closeness between a brand and a consumer's self-concept is a desirable marketing outcome and an effective input to brand loyalty. However, as the current research shows, it's not only the difference between the consumer and the brand that matters, it's the manner in which this distance interacts with how we as marketers speak to consumers about our brands, which is something that we show can easily be managed by keying in on the level of distance between the consumer and the brand. We find that matching close brands with concrete language and distant brands with abstract language in marketing communications leads to higher spending, donations, and brand evaluations. And this finding highlights how managers can better realize value from relationships, not only when the brand is close to the consumer, but importantly, when it is not. In light of this, we assert that psychological distance should be given due consideration as a segmentation variable. For example, using what consumers write on social media, market research firms or in-house teams can easily develop real-time monitoring tools based on dictionaries that reflect the relative distance and then target consumer segments accordingly. As psychological distance can be easily captured with an easy to implement one-item measure. Finally, simple changes in how information was presented in brand communications cause distant consumers to even spend as much as close consumers in some cases. This result may be surprising when framed in light of marketers' enthusiasm for relationship building. While close relationships are undoubtedly an asset to the firm, our findings still suggest that a minimal investment strategy designed to leverage this brand asset without attempting to alter the asset itself could be quite effective.
Finally, our research uncovers key brand level variables that impact both the strength of our effect and when concrete or abstract language should be used. For ease of implementation, we have distilled this down to a decision tree that you see here. We first start at the top asking ourselves, are my customers regular users of the brand? Or in other words, do my customers have some type of relationship with the brand? If no, customers will simply not sufficiently attend to communications for any effects to occur. However, if yes, then the next step is to figure out how does our brand tend to be perceived and whether or not consumers can get all necessary information about the brand prior to purchase. Depending on the answer, different marketing communications language will be suitable. For most closed brands, the answer to this latter question is no, that consumers do not typically get all necessary information about the brand prior to purchase, which is why you should use concrete language. However, when a more rare answer is yes, and consumers typically get all necessary information about the brand prior to purchase, in that case, use abstract language with a closed brand. This is because the novelty of being exposed to information that is incongruent with the associated construal mindset will actually better capture consumer attention and influence their subsequent evaluations. And for distant brands, if no, then again, follow our main recommendation and use abstract language. If consumers can get all necessary information about the brand prior to purchase, though, use concrete language for distant brands. And with that, we'd like to conclude. Thank you, everyone. We'd be happy to hear about any of your questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott and Mansour. Super interesting. So we now have some time for questions, and I see that we have a few that are here. So let me bring those up, and I can ask Mansour and Scott for their responses. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A function. So what about, so Howard has a question. It's kind of like one that I had, which is, isn't it really desirable to work to create those closer brand relationships? Or are you basically saying that, you know, it's that brands should abandon committed relationships with their customers?
Sure, I'll take this one. Howard and Christine, you're absolutely right. There's certainly value in creating these close brand relationships, and when you can, identify your segments that are going to be more receptive to these relationship building efforts, it's definitely a valuable route to pursue. What we're suggesting is we're just kind of accepting the fact that a lot of consumers don't want to move into these committed and strong relationships, and And so what we're looking at is, well, what do we do with those that kind of get left behind by these processes, and how can we, leverage and create value from those that choose to be in a more distant relationship with the brand? And that's what we think one of the strong points of our findings are here.
And so we have somebody writing in from or participating from Indiana, Mansour. So Ordelia asks about other ways that you could use your approach. So besides, because I think the real power of your approach is because you're able to use it in really almost any marketing communication. It could be a salesperson, you use it within advertising, but are there other ways that outside of marketing communications that your ideas might be utilized?
I believe so. So what we sort of focused on so far in our set of studies that we ran, yes, we acknowledge that most of the stuff that we did was with kind of concrete or abstract claims embedded within advertisement. But there's a reason to believe, right? Like based on some of our pre-tests that we ran and also our general theory is that the effect should not be necessarily limited to those contexts. So good examples that you provided would be salesperson to consumer communication, service person to consumer communication, and things like that. Now, always when extending our like claims to those kinds of contexts, right? Like this is always obviously an empirical question, but again, if our principles hold, which we believe they do over a series of studies, we should also be able to extend that to, like, let's say these type of communications, or even for that matter, brand communications on social media, when there's no advertisement per se, but there's more of a direct one-to-one message that you send to consumers.
Well, and that was actually a question from one of the listeners about, have you tried to beta, test this on websites? Because websites would be an easy way to see if the theories apply. I could also imagine with product labeling, on the actual package that you could use this as well. So it seems to have, I think that's one of the things that I thought was so powerful about the piece, is that it has such potential applicability. And I guess it should apply to both. Somebody's asking about B2B versus B2C. I would imagine there would be no difference, but what do you think? Laura's asking that question. Or Laurie, sorry. Yes.
Scott, I can take that one. So
Sure, Mansour.
Yeah, so the beautiful kind of thing about this phenomenon we're studying is that it's actually in fact very much broad and generalizable. And I also saw some brief comment in chat. So first of all, yes, the type of brands that we showcase and focus on today when we present to you are undoubtedly B2C focused, which we definitely realize. But in the studies we ran, at least a couple of them, we allowed people to nominate or self-select the type of companies that they, again, either feel close to or distant from. And what we found was that there was actually a very substantial number of B2B brands, or brands that do not operate in traditional kind of direct to consumer domain. And yes, absolutely, effects for those held. And then that thing also applies to sort of referencing one quick comment that I may have take a look at the chat, country-wise perspectives too. So like the studies we ran, the two ones that we present, Singapore and Canada, we ran a bunch in the US, and we did not, to the best of our memory, notice any systematic differences such that like the effect is way weaker or way stronger in one context than another.
Well, and let's keep talking about this topic, because Laura has a question about whether brand distance is actually a result of brand saturation. Is it just a relationship thing between the customer and the brand, or is it influenced by other sorts of factors? She mentions brand saturation, or you could say more educated consumers. So what's the sort of essence of this idea of brand relationships? And maybe as you answer that, you can also come back to a question that Howard asked about measuring brand closeness and these brand relationships. You use the zipper scale, which we saw at the end, where people have to take the circles and bring them closer or further apart. But is there a way to get at that, and other ways to get at that you might be able to share with people?
Sure, I can take this one. In terms of the result of brand distance, there's been some prior research, looking at, there's a whole host of different reasons why a consumer may feel distant to a brand. And I know there was a question asking, maybe why Durex was taken as a distant brand in this case. And in some cases, it's because you may be sort of aversive to the brand or you feel stuck using them. You use them because you don't have any other options. We see examples like Durex where it's more of a taboo product, so you kind of don't want it being associated with your self-concept, so you look to distance yourself in that regard. We also see, there's differences in the extent to which people incorporate brands into their self-concept in general. And so those types of people may fall into that more educated consumer who, typically just distrust brands in general, maybe. And so they're less likely to form these strong brands in the first place. And so it may speak to those individuals as well. To the second comment, so looking at different ways of managing brand closeness, we don't do it in our research, but we certainly, are aware that there are linguistic coding measures that can capture concrete versus abstract language, and we can catch it on that side of it in order to be able to get a sense of how people are talking about a brand, which we can then sort of use to sort of approximate this a little bit as well, maybe in terms of level of closeness. And also, you can certainly code in different terms that may seem to capture closeness versus distance as well.
Nice. And Vishwas asks a question about brand personality and the consumer personality. Whether that's important to psychological distance. There was an earlier question from someone about culture and the role of culture. These are obviously other factors that reflect whether you end up in a close situation or not, I would imagine. So does that influence your results at all, do you think? Or is that just part of the formation of the degree to which the relationship is strong or not?
So I think a lot of it also really fundamentally goes back to the formation of relationship, right? So from like decades of research, for example, on brand personality that Renan and Daria kindly reviewed for us, or from other type of work, we know that to an extent that there is an overlap between, let's say, your sense of personality as a consumer and the brand sense of personality, that would by all means absolutely influence the degree of perceived closeness, right? So the greater there is an overlap, that's going to be very influential in forming that closeness. Same thing would be, I think, the cultural perspective, right? Whereas we still observed kind of our effects rather uniformly. I mean, I could totally see how, let's say, again, for a consumer, like let's say if you're coming from a particular country context or cultural context, and then the brand actually does the same thing. So it's from the same country, kind of like country of origin effect, right? Or a similar culture. Again, that would definitely be not the only factor, but one of the factors that would make brand seem closer to you, or in opposite, like distant as well.
Let me finish with one final question, which seems to be really important, which is that you mentioned obviously this idea of well, let me just suggest that you could use, and I think you said this in your very last slide, that's this psychological distance could be used as the basis for segmentation. But when you think about segmentation, if you were segmenting on that, you would have all different kinds of consumers in there, consumers with many different types of relationships with the firm. Can you just share concretely how you would imagine a marketer would use the insights as the basis for segmentation?
Sure, I think I could touch that, and I think the best way to maybe answer that would be to put some color from an example from one of our studies where we actually had people kind of elicit their own brand that they felt close or distant to. And one brand in that study that we found actually came up in both of those groups. So we had the Walmart Great Value brand, which is one that some people felt very close to, yet others felt distance. And so this sort of raises this segmentation question. And so looking at our data, we had them kind of explain why they felt distant to it. And so what you see is we have groups of people they tended to be, more of a younger segment in this regard, and they were using the product because it was cheap. But again, it was something they didn't want people associating with them, that they were using the Walmart brand or wearing Walmart clothing and that sort of thing. On the other side of things, those that felt close tend to be more of the the family segment that relied on Walmart's great prices, and therefore they felt close because they were able to meet their brands and provide for their families. And so Walmart was an important staple for them. And so I think when you start understanding, why your consumers are using your brand, you can start to get a sense of which segments are going to feel more closer or more distant to the brand, which sort of will, help to make this segmentation process a bit more effective.
Wonderful. So we'll go ahead and paste the materials related to your paper. There's the actual Journal of Marketing article, but also the sort of managerial version that may be helpful to some of you, as well as some additional social media information. We'll make all of that available in the chat. But let me also thank you, Scott and Munzer, for the presentation and for the answers to the questions that our listeners have asked. So thank you again.